Welcome, everyone, to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. In Hebrew, our name is Habitchonistim. IDSF is the leading Israeli organization advocating for strong national security-oriented policies to guide the state of Israel. We are a movement of more than 20,000 people, including many, many reserve officers and operators from all branches of the Israel Defense establishment. I have a very special guest with me today, Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Hirsch. Maurice was with us in the past on one of these briefings, and we had so much to discuss, we ended short. So this time we're going to do a deep dive with Maurice and really cover many important issues. He is the director of the Initiative for Palestinian Authority Accountability and Reform in the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, and a senior legal analyst at Human Rights Voices. He served for 19 years in the IDF Military Advocate General Court. In his last position, he served as the director of the military prosecution in Judea and Samaria. And of course, he is a member of IDSF. Maurice, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me again.
So let's start off talking about the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, their claims against Israel, Israel's felt need to defend themselves. What can you share with us about that?
So really, when we're talking about the ICJ, we have to really distinguish between a few different really hats that the ICJ wears. One is to be an arbitrator of cases that are brought before the court on different grounds between countries. They have conflicts. They can agree to go to the ICJ. The second function is to provide the United Nations General Assembly with advisory opinions. That we've seen not a small amount of happen, not a small amount of time. Also on Israel, we saw the referral of the question of Israel's security wall to prevent the infiltration of Palestinian suicide bombers from Judea and Samaria into Israel's heartland and major towns. And the result of that was a biased decision which said that, well, basically the Jews don't have any right to self-defense, and therefore actually creating this physical barrier was illegal. Obviously, a completely ridiculous decision in and of itself. And then the ICJ has this third function. And really that's what we're talking about when we're talking about in the function of genocide. It has this third function as the court that deals with the Convention for on the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide, where you have countries who are involved in a conflict. One country claims against another country that that country is committing a genocide, and so the court then addresses that question. Now, we all know what a genocide is. We saw it actually recently very clearly on the 7th of October, when you see thousands of terrorists, bloodthirsty, genocidal terrorists swarming Israel's borders, infiltrating Israel, infiltrating towns, cities, kibbutzim, and then murdering really en masse, raping, torturing, butchering, burning alive everyone, beheading people. And that's really a clear case of genocide. And so what I would assume you would have is this, possibly this claim that someone comes in and says, well, there's this fake state that's called Palestine, and they've committed a genocide. And unfortunately, that's not what we had. What we saw was that South Africa, and I say this quite jokingly, this bastion of democracy and of tolerance that has been really entertaining and hosting and mollycoddling Hamas for the last few years, putting in this really grotesque claim that Israel, in its self-defense against these homicidal terrorists, is committing a genocide. Now, there are many sides to this question. Well, firstly, if the ICJ is meant to only adjudicate disputes between the parties, well, what claim is there between South Africa and Israel? And really the initial thought should be that this case should be rejected already out of hand, because there's no basic standing for South Africa. The problem with that argument is just a few years ago, it turns out that Africa despite being the place where many a genocide has been committed, is now turning out to be the guardian of genocides all over the world. And a few years ago, you had the case of Gambia submitting a complaint against Myanmar for the alleged genocide against the Rohingyas. And the court then deciding, well, it's not limited, the jurisdiction of the court is not limited only to the disputes between the two fighting sides, the two parties, but rather any country can step in and any country can make really this wide claims against any other country. And then that opens the discussion. Now, that's something obviously which South Africa, as we know, at the behest of the Palestinian Authority, South Africa is no great defender of genocides. We know that. And really, South Africa here is just acting as a puppet, both in the hands of the Palestinian Authority and of the Iranian regime, which is really seeking to vilify Israel in every forum possible. And really, this is part of the combination of the violent attacks on the ground by the Iranian proxies, whether it be Hezbollah in the north, the Houthis from Yemen, and obviously Hamas. But now to add this additional layer of warfare, but in a court. That's why it's called lawfare. And to get Israel embroiled in this discussion as to whether we, in our just war against the homicidal terrorists, are carrying out a genocide, when the basic claim for that is that some 20-odd thousand Palestinians have died, and that's clearly a genocide. So says South Africa. They take no time whatsoever to investigate, well, how many of those people were actually terrorists? All they do is parrot the Hamas propaganda, the statistics of the Hamas Ministry of Health in Gaza that says that X number of people has died, and that's it. That's their claim. They then add on this level of very unimportant people making very uninformed statements and say, well, this is clear evidence of Israel's intention. Now, that in legal terms should be clearly understood as just garbage. But unfortunately, you have this whole process where the court is now stepping up. Now, what should be really a no-brainer case for anyone to understand gets a little bit more complicated in any international forum. And when you look at the makeup of the court, then you suddenly understand that, well, Israel could potentially have a substantial problem here. It doesn't matter what the facts are. It doesn't matter that there's clearly no intention of Israel to carry out a genocide. They allege that we've dropped some 80,000 tons of munitions on Gaza. Well, that means that we didn't even manage to kill one Palestinian with every ton of bombs that we dropped, right? Because there's 22,000, 23,000 people killed, 80,000 tons of bombs. And so we're clearly the most ineffective genocidal army ever in the history of man and of genocide. But that doesn't really bother them. And when you understand that on the court, you have judges from countries like Morocco. Well, what's Morocco gonna decide? I would like to believe that in this new age of the Abraham Accords, Morocco's obviously party to that there will be some type of a change in their approach, but I fear not. Somalia. What is Somalia going to decide? Somalia is one of these places where constantly there is terrorism, constantly there are massive terror attacks, but they are constantly anti-Israel. Uganda. Now, wonder for yourselves what the Lebanese judge is going to decide. How much of his decision will be based on a fact basis, and rather as opposed to, well, how much on his belief that, well, Israel's now killing Salah Aruri, this mass terrorist in Beirut, where he's been hosted for the last years. So you have this makeup of the court, and then you get into it. China, Russia. What's Russia going to decide? The most recent case in the court was actually the case for the genocide, was really the case of Russia and the Ukraine. Um, so what exactly is Russia going to do with that? And you see all of these judges, you don't really know. One would hope that the president of the court, who's an American judge, will actually adjudicate the case clearly on its lack of merits. But it's also very clear that much of the decisions will be driven by this inherent bias that really I think to a great extent really defines the UN in general, where the Arab countries and the African Union countries and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation has an automatic a majority. And as Abba Eben, I apologize, I won't give the exact quote, but I think he said something like this: if one of the Arab countries were to suggest, or one of the African countries were to suggest that the world is flat because the Jews made it flat, it would pass and be accepted in the UN with a majority of 200 countries against the only 193 countries that there are there. I obviously you understand the joke, and with no abstentions, because obviously the Jews are responsible for everything. And so that's really the breakdown of this whole ICJ farce. I should say, just to make that picture a little bit clearer and even more stark in its ridiculous nature. On October 7th and since then, Israel arrested alive, for whatever reasons, not a small number of these terrorists, and is now in the process of investigating them and preparing indictments against them. Now, unfortunately, our legislators haven't listened to my calls and warnings, and they seem to be accepting for the moment the opinion of some of the legal institutions in Israel, the prosecution being one of them, that Israel can prosecute these Nukhba terrorists, these really vile animals that beheaded babies and raped women and tortured people and burnt people alive. They can prosecute them based on a law in Israel that was adopted in 1951, following Israel's accession to and acceptance of the Convention Against Genocide, and that these terrorists will actually be charged with genocide. That's really a little bit of what's going on in this whole jungle of genocide and ICJ grotesqueness, with the South African puppets of their Iranian masters, and the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, this so-called moderate organization that has now started paying the cash rewards to these same terrorists, all the time standing in the back and pushing on this whole process.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. Wow, I wanna hone in for a second on that kind of side note you had about the prosecution of the Hamas terrorists.
Yeah.
Are you able just to elaborate? What do you think the other legal entities are suggesting to be done, and what specifically do you want to see that's different? If you could just explain that in more detail.
Well, so I think there is very little, unfortunately, very little creative thought going on in general at the moment. There is the insistence of Israel's official legal system that the current law is sufficient in order to prosecute all of those terrorists. Obviously, we have a very well developed criminal justice system. We have a crime of murder. We have a crime of rape. We have a crime of arson. We have a crime of kidnapping. Now, and what they're saying is that we can use those crimes, and where in doubt, we can use the law against genocide as that framework for prosecution. I feel that this is a gross mistake. I think that as a declaratory move, nothing, even that alone, a special law should have been passed in order to deal with the effects and the events of the massacre. Obviously, we can't be in breach of the basic fundamental principle of criminal law, that you can't criminalize an act in retrospect, right? So we're not going to do that. That's not something that Israel does. But for example, and the way forward that I suggested in a number of articles was that Israel now adopt an amended and really more relevant version of the law that was passed a little bit later in Israel in 1954, the law for the prosecution of the Nazi war criminals and their assistants. That's a much more comprehensive law. I think it gives a better framework of what we're talking about, of the nature of that event. Really, the same argument that's being made now could have been made then. Well, it's a crime of genocide. We don't have to do anything. We've got that law and we don't need anything special. But no, the Israeli legislature specifically said, we want something specific, something new, something that is unique for this event of the Holocaust. And that should have been the same approach that was adopted now. Unfortunately, for the last 90 odd days, that has been somewhat rejected. I understand that there is a subcommittee in the relevant committee of the Knesset that's now going to start discussing alternatives to that approach that's been presented until now. It really is full of, unfortunately, far too many pitfalls and traps that Israel really shouldn't get into and could possibly avoid. I'll give just one example. How do you define the laws of accomplices and partners to the crime in that event of the massacre? Is each individual site seen by itself, or do you take every one of the 32 different sites as a whole? How do you prosecute a terrorist who was operating in Kfar Aza and who was murdering and slaughtering and raping and beheading in Kfar Aza, with and attribute to him the responsibility for what was going on at the Nova Music Festival? Two completely separate places. But obviously these events are not separate from each other, and they should be seen as a whole. And that's something which I fear the Israeli criminal law, basic criminal law, which is there to deal with, criminals. It's not there to deal with events of this scale, of this complexity, and of this nature. And therefore that's something that really should be, I think, dealt with through direct legislation.
And was there a lacking in the Eichmann trial, for example, in terms of linking the totality of the Holocaust there?
No, because that was the specific law that was passed for prosecuting Nazis and their assistants, and that really provided that basis. There was also really that entire role of Adolf Eichmann in carrying out and as the architect or a joint architect at least of the final solution of the genocide. So there was that aspect. Here we're not talking about the same level of people. Here we're talking about not the planners at the top, those people who are really active all over, but rather the people at the bottom who actually carried out the genocide. And there were very and I say this with a particularly heavy heart. There were very, very few low-level Nazis prosecuted for the murders that they committed. What we saw as part of the Nuremberg trials was really the top echelons, even the later prosecutions, really only dealt predominantly with the more senior people, and you had really tens of thousands of murdering Nazis who just got away with what they did. And so that's something which now we're actually talking about, those people on the ground, those people who actually burnt babies to death, who beheaded who raped our women, who murdered people after tying them together with metal cables. So it's just a different experience. It's a different level.
Wow, wow. These are hard things to talk about, but certainly very important. If we can go back to the ICJ where we started from, if the ICJ comes out with a ruling that is negative towards Israel, could that affect Israel's relationship with its allies in North America and the European Union? Meaning, forget Uganda, forget those other countries you mentioned. With our friends, will it make a difference?
So I think that we have to put two things very clear. I don't think it's if there's a decision made. I think that it's almost inevitable that a decision against Israel will be made. I have unfortunately very little either faith or respect for the court and its ability to be independent and really to judge the case on its merits or lack of thereof, as the case may be. And so the question is, well, what do you do then with a decision of the court? Really, the main way to really bring those decisions to fruition, to force them on the countries, is then a possible referral to the UN Security Council, because the court doesn't have its own soldiers or enforcers, right? So, and one would hope that in the Security Council, after America, after the White House has already gone on record saying that this claim, this complaint is completely baseless and lacking in any validity, one would hope that America would then use its veto in the Security Council, and I believe that will be the same for most of Israel's true allies. Now, unfortunately, the word "true allies" very much cuts down the number of countries that are in that little circle. Unfortunately, many countries in Europe that should be supportive, that claim to be supportive when push comes to shove, they're the same countries who are often voting against Israel, also in the United Nations, and are often critical of Israel without really any true basis.
Okay, so outside of the US, can you think of any meaningful, substantive, legal, diplomatic, or trade efforts that are being done by the international community to help Israel in this war?
So I think that sadly the answer is no. I think that the October 7 massacre of the Jews was and the empathy that was felt very soon afterwards has very quickly passed. Now the BBC, CNN, and all of these other news agencies are obsessed with the Palestinian victimhood and with showing the pictures of dead Palestinian babies. They don't care that Hamas put those babies in front of them and use them positively as human shields. They don't ask those questions. They don't really care because they don't even accept the right of the Jews to their own self-defense. And unfortunately, nothing really has come about. What should have been done immediately, based on the pictures that we're seeing and really the information that the IDF, and I have to really give a good word here to the IDF spokesman and to the IDF in general, not only the soldiers on the ground, but the spokesman, releasing really a tremendous amount of information, for example, about schools, UNRWA schools that are being used to attack soldiers, rocket launch sites that were adjacent to UNRWA schools and in UNRWA installations, the teachers who were UNRWA teachers who were party to holding Israeli hostages. All of these things, these unfortunately, what we knew about the evil nature of UNRWA has been playing out so clearly, and yet there hasn't been one initiative that says, you know what, UNRWA is funded by the international community. What we've actually been funding is willful blindness at the worst, at the best, excuse me, and at worst, we've been funding this organization that has been an integral part of educating the Gazans to hate, despise, and want to murder Jews. And really, what the world should have said, starting with America, is that there's no more money for UNRWA. UNRWA as an organization is inherently evil. It inherently perpetuates this idea that the Palestine refugees will one day flood Israel and destroy it demographically and democratically. And in the meantime, they're teaching those same people to hate Israel and prepare to murder them. That's not something which I would say that our greatest ally or anyone else with any modicum of humanity should be funding. And I would say the immediate call should be not to allow UNRWA to provide for the humanitarian needs, so-called, of the Palestinians, but really for the immediate disbanding and defunding of UNRWA.
We're almost out of time, but just to ask you, do you think there is enough consensus in Israel in that in the day after scenario, the government will be able to block UNRWA from reestablishing?
I think there is enough consensus in Israel, firstly, to push the government to finish the job. First and foremost, we need to win the war. We need to be able to destroy the Hamas terrorists and their infrastructure and everything that they use as their base for power, and then move on. I think thereafter there is not a small amount of support for the understanding that Israel needs to control the Gaza Strip and to create a reality in which this type of hostility can never be seen again. That October 7 will never happen again. And I think there is enough understanding now in the Israeli population as well to say that one of the major contributing factors to the massacre was UNRWA, and therefore there is, I think, broad consensus that UNRWA is a substantial part of the problem and no part of the solution, and therefore it should not be allowed to function anymore in general, and definitely not in Gaza.
Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Hirsch, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for sharing all of this. Really
Thank you
very
very much for having me.
fascinating. I feel like we could speak for another 30 minutes, but alas, we don't have the time. So we'll end it here. Thank you so much to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning in. We will be back with you tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, with a critical update from Brigadier General Amir Avivi. Until then, stay safe, stay strong, take care, everyone.